Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm also a PhD student in finance, and this is my dissertation essay, similar to Pedro. So it's on does government contracting impact venture capital investment outcomes? And why I'm working for government contracting, I have another paper on government contracting also with Dr. Cumming. I've worked in several companies before I started my PhD program, also in Russia, in St. Petersburg. We had government as customers. I worked in Renaissance Construction. And I firsthand experienced how we treat government differently as customer, as stakeholder, and how it impacts our policies. And in this paper, I examine how government contracting impact venture capital outcomes in small businesses, right? So the modern cooperation is the hub of contracts, the nexus of contracts, and then the firm is defined as nexus of different contracts, and this study examines how the contracts between the different stakeholders, government as customer and venture capital investors as stakeholders, interact with each other, what's the outcome of this interaction, right? What is venture capital firms? They are typically financial intermediators. They take money from institutional investors and invest in private companies, usually young high-tech companies. And often it's venture capital industry shown main reasons for development of US companies, from entrepreneurial ideas to large corporations. And also government contracting, why it is important. US government spends about $500 billion every year on procurement contracts. It's world's largest customer. And also they need to spend some on small businesses, about 26% of it spent on small businesses, but no study examines how it impacts these small businesses, right? So I'm trying to answer these questions in this paper. And then small businesses and government contracting, although the government is obligated to allocate some contracts to small businesses, these businesses are reluctant to bid for government contracts because it's a lengthy process. It takes a lot of longer cycle and complex procedures. So venture capitals may help these small businesses in this process. And a former senior investment officer of Bush and Obama administration, he launched a VC firm specifically trying to find firms who don't have contracts and help them to get contracts to go public or get acquired. So many VC firms try to avoid government because of its complexities. They call it black box of Washington, but you can't avoid such a large customer. It will be at your own peril, right? So in my research question is about VC firms who first invest in these private companies, then whether these companies receive government contracts with, after VC investment, and what is the outcome, right? What does they go public or get acquired, or does it impact their likelihood of getting liquidated or bankrupt? And whether the bargaining power of these private firms relative to government impacts this relationship, right? So this is the main two questions I'm trying to answer in this essay. So we contribute to the VC exits, value adding, and then government contracting literature. So my first hypothesis why it should impact, right? Government is less likely to switch suppliers. There are studies showing that they are more likely to engage in longer contracts. They're less likely to default. Right, so it creates operating stability for the companies. And also government is a strict monitoring, and they have ability to monitor these firms, and they have public scrutiny around government contractors. So it creates better information environment for these companies. And then we see exit outcomes depends on their ability to, so they usually invest in these small companies. They know track record, a lot of information asymmetry and a lot of uncertainty. And their outcome depends on their ability to mitigate these problems. And then the government contracting helps these VC firms in diminishing future uncertainties and information asymmetries, and will help, I predict that it will help the likelihood of IPOs and acquisitions and lower the likelihood of liquidations. And if the second hypothesis about the bargaining power, if the a company has a greater bargaining power relative to government. So I measured using Michael Porter's competition theory, right? So that if they have a greater power relative to government, the government even less likely to switch, right? And then they even more likely to engage in long-term contracts. So there's even stronger operating uncertainty for these firms. But if the firm has a stronger government power against government, then government is weaker monitorer because they don't have as power, they are not as powerful to monitor, so the information impact is weaker. And so I predict that, so information impact is important for IPOs when you have a lot of public traders who don't have the ability to do due diligence. On the other hand, for acquirers, it's less important. And operating stability, I believe, is more important for acquisition and liquidation decisions. So I believe that government contractors with greater bargaining power actually less likely to go public, but they are more likely to get acquired and less likely to be liquidated. And then the data comes from a venture expert database and also federal procurement data system that's publicly available, right? So you can get US government contract data from there. And I match this to data sets using fuzzy matching. And then I have final sample of 69,000 round by round VC investments, right, on 13,000 firms. And the contracting I measure by whether they have contract with government or not, what's the total value of contract, and VC exit outcomes, whether they go public, acquired, or they get liquidated, because we cannot measure the VC returns because that data is not available. These proxies, exit outcomes proxies for the VC investment performance, follow the prior literature on that. And the bargaining power measures also developed based on the Porter's theory of competition, whether the industry is more concentrated, whether a contract is allocated through competitive or non-competitive, whether it's the defense contractor, they have more power against government. So then I analyze this using Logit and hazard models. And so I find that a government contracting, so this is a government contracting relative to the VC investment. So 3 years before, 2 years before, 1 year before, and then 1 year, 2 years, 3 years after, right? So there is linear increase in average value of government contract value. So there is no discontinuity when VC enters, but the quality of contracts improves. Like there's a big jump right after VC enters. So they help them negotiate better and compete for better government contracts. And a univariate analysis shows that IPO firms are more likely to get government contracts. About 9.4% of them had government contracts prior to they went public. And on average, it's only 6.4% of the VC investments involved government contracting. So this univariate analysis shows that IPOs, contractors are more likely to go public and get acquired and less likely to be liquidated. And then Logit analysis, I show that the contracting impacts, increases the likelihood of acquisitions and IPOs and reduce the likelihood of liquidations, and also using propensity score matching sample. And then hazard model shows that it fastens the IPO process, time to IPO and acquisition, and also as well as improving the likelihood of them and reducing likelihood of liquidation. And then this is for second hypothesis that I use introduction term with industry concentration. So the impact of government contracting is weaker for highly concentrated industries where the supplier have a greater power, right? And then it's only for competitive contracts they're more likely to go public, but if they get non-competitive contracts, they are less likely to get public, to go public. And for acquisitions, for example, it's opposite. Both non and competitive and non-competitive contracts help them to get acquired. Right? So in general, I find that post-investment government contracting activity of portfolio companies improves their likelihood of going public and acquired, and reduce their likelihood of liquidation. And contractors with greater bargaining power relative to government are less likely to go public, but more likely to get acquired and less likely to be liquidated. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Please, the questions welcome. It's a new area for us. Is there any success story that you have in mind, like specific firm that was that grew successful due to both venture financing and government contracts, something that made big news, something that attracted?
Yeah, I can find and add some, but in my motivation, I mentioned a paper that, I mean, a venture capital firm that specifically focuses on these companies. That is by Yanev. It's called. So this venture capital firm specifically focuses on these firms who don't have contract and help them to get contracts and go public. but I can add a example of like success stories that will help motivation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any success stories mentioned here, but that in my mind.
Yeah,
but
we have this idea that the contracting is a big budget, and venture financing is obviously a big industry. But for for outside observer, it's really hard to come up with the linking between the two. The linkage looks very interesting, and it's provocative. But for us, if there was like one or two firm names, it's like what happened to them, like would be easier to get more attached to the story.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'll add some of the success stories, like from even using
or failure stories that those made good news too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Big news. Yeah, not good news, big news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. It's good comment.